Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Sometimes we find ourselves diving into some really complex topics, but today we're looking at something that seems simple at first but gets really fascinating the deeper you go. We're talking about barometric pressure. And you know what? Based on all the articles and research you sent in, there's way more to it than just, your ears popping on a plane.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those things we experience all the time without even realizing it,
It's
right?
absolutely like it's always there, this weight of the air around us. But we don't think about it much unless something dramatic happens.
It really is a fundamental force, though, affecting everything from the weather to our health, even the planet itself.
It's true. So, to help us unpack all of this, we've got an expert with us today who can, well, connect the dots across meteorology, health, engineering, even geology.
Happy to be here, ready to dive in.
All right, perfect. So, let's start simple. High and low pressure systems. We see them on weather maps all the time, but what's actually going on there?
Okay, so think of the atmosphere like a giant seesaw, right?
Okay, I like where this is going.
High pressure is where the atmosphere is heavy, so the air sinks. That's when you get those beautiful, clear, sunny days. But low pressure, that's where the atmosphere is light, and the air rises, cools, and condenses. And you know what that means, right?
Clouds and
You
storm.
got it. Clouds, storms, all that exciting weather stuff.
Makes sense. And that difference in pressure, high to low, is what actually creates wind, right? Like air flowing from one to the other.
Exactly. Winds is basically a global delivery system, moving all that heat and moisture around, creating all the weather patterns we see.
Wow, I never thought of wind like that before. A delivery system, that's cool. Speaking of wild weather, I found this crazy fact while prepping for our deep dive. The highest barometric pressure ever recorded was 1583.8 hectopascals. That was in Siberia back in 1968. It's incredible.
That is high. And on the flip side, the lowest ever recorded was 870 HPA during Typhoon Tip in 1979.
That's a massive difference. Speaking of low pressure and powerful storms, Hurricane Wilma back in 2005. Do you remember that one? Oh, how could I forget? That was devastating.
Its pressure plunged to 882 HPA. I mean, that's a lot of energy, right? The wind speeds were over 175 miles per hour.
Exactly. That rapid pressure drop fuels those intense hurricane winds. The energy has to go somewhere.
So is that kind of similar to what happens with those bomb cyclones we keep hearing about in the news?
Exactly. They intensify super fast. The pressure drops at least 24 HPA in just 24 hours, and all that energy gets unleashed in those crazy winds and heavy precipitation.
Okay, so we've got the basics of pressure and weather down. But here's where things get really interesting for me, and I bet for our listeners too. You know how sometimes you feel achy, maybe a bit headachy before a storm rolls in? Is that a real thing?
There's definitely growing evidence that it's more than just an old wives' tale.
Mm.
Some people get what's called a barometric pressure headache. The changes in the atmosphere can actually trigger it. Wow. So it's like our bodies have their own built-in barometers. They're giving us these warning signals. That's amazing.
But it's not just migraines, right? What about joint pain? My grandma always swore she could feel a storm coming in her knees.
It's a common belief, and some studies have shown a possible link. The idea is that when the barometric pressure falls, it might cause swelling in tissues or affect the pressure within joints.
So grandma might have been onto something.
She might have, but the research isn't totally clear yet. There was this huge study published in the BMJ with millions of doctor visits, and they didn't find a strong link between rainfall, which usually comes with low pressure, and joint pain.
Oh, that is surprising. I guess it probably affects some people more than others, right?
Probably. It's complex. We're still learning about how sensitive people are to these pressure changes. But even if we don't fully understand it yet, I wouldn't want to be stuck in a hurricane with a migraine and achy joints.
Oh, absolutely not. And it's not just aches and pains either. I read that pressure drops can actually affect our hearts too. Yeah, research suggests there might be a link between sudden pressure drops and an increased risk of heart attacks, especially for people who already have heart conditions.
Wait, really? How does that work?
One theory is that when the pressure goes down, blood vessels might constrict or thicken, putting more stress on the heart.
Oh, wow. I'm starting to see how something invisible like barometric pressure can have a big impact on us. And what about altitude sickness? Isn't that also related to air pressure?
Absolutely. The higher you go, the thinner the air gets. And that means lower barometric pressure. Less oxygen is available for our bodies.
Right. Hence the headaches you get when you're hiking in the mountains. I remember feeling that way in the Rockies.
That's a classic example. Lower oxygen leads to headaches, nausea, fatigue. Your body's basically saying, hey, I need more air up here.
So we've talked about how pressure affects us personally, but I'm curious, does all this come into play with engineering? Do engineers have to think about barometric pressure when they're designing things?
All the time. It's crucial in many fields, especially when you're dealing with altitude or extreme weather. Take airplanes, for example. They're basically flying barometers.
Okay, that's a good one. But seriously, how does pressure affect airplane design?
Well, they use what are called barometric altimeters to measure altitude. It's basically a barometer that senses the air pressure outside and uses that to figure out how high the plane is flying. Accurate readings are critical, especially for landings. You don't want to be off by a few hundred feet when you're coming in.
Definitely not. And then there's that whole cabin pressurization thing. How do they keep us from passing out at 30,000 feet?
It's pretty amazing, really. They create this sealed system that pumps air into the cabin, maintaining a pressure that's similar to what you'd experience at around 6,000 to 8,000 feet.
So the pressure inside the plane is way different from the pressure outside at that altitude.
Oh yeah, we're talking a pressure difference of over 550 HPA when you're up at cruising altitude.
Hmm.
The fuselage has to be incredibly strong to handle that. It's like a giant pressure vessel.
That's mind-boggling. And I bet all that pressurizing and depressurizing takes a toll on the plane, right?
It does. Remember that Aloha Airlines Flight 243. Part of the reason the fuselage ruptured mid-flight was because of metal fatigue from all those pressurization cycles.
Okay, airplanes are officially impressive now. But what about buildings? I've heard of tornadoes making houses explode because of sudden pressure changes.
That's right. The pressure changes we experience every day don't really affect buildings too much, but when you have those rapid pressure drops during a tornado or a hurricane, it can create immense forces.
So what's actually happening there?
Imagine this. The pressure outside suddenly plummets during a tornado, but the air inside the house is still at its normal pressure. It's like having hundreds of pounds per square foot pushing out on the walls and roof.
So it's like the house is trying to inflate like a balloon.
Exactly. And if there's not enough venting, all that pressure can shatter windows, collapse walls, even make the whole structure explode outwards.
Okay, that's terrifying. What about that advice people give about opening windows during a tornado to equalize the pressure?
You know, that's actually a myth, and engineers say it's not a good idea. Your priority should be finding shelter and protecting yourself, not messing with windows. Most buildings will vent pressure naturally anyway.
Good to know. So the engineers definitely have to factor these extreme pressure events into their designs, especially in places where hurricanes are common. But here's a question that just blows my mind. Can barometric pressure actually affect things like earthquakes and volcanoes?
It might sound unbelievable, but there's actually a growing body of research suggesting that it can in subtle ways.
Okay, you have my attention. Tell me more.
Let's start with earthquakes. Regular weather doesn't seem to have a big impact on typical earthquakes, but there's evidence that huge pressure changes, like the kind you get with really powerful storms, can trigger what are called slow earthquakes or tremors.
Slow earthquakes. What are those?
They're basically fault slips that release energy really gradually over hours or days instead of all at once. It's like a slow-motion earthquake.
Okay, interesting. So how does pressure play into that?
Researchers in Taiwan found that most of the slow earthquakes they detected happened when typhoons hit the region. They think that the sudden pressure drop during a typhoon kind of unloads the Earth's crust, reducing pressure on the faults and maybe triggering these slow slips.
So it's like the typhoon is lifting a weight off the fault.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just slow earthquakes. Some early research even suggests that gradual pressure changes, just a few hectopascals over a couple of days, might influence the timing of regular earthquakes.
Really? But those are such tiny changes compared to the forces moving tectonic plates. How could they have any effect?
Think of it like this. If a fault is already close to its breaking point, even a little change in pressure could be enough to push it over the edge.
Fascinating. So pressure might be like a subtle trigger for earthquakes, not the main cause, but a contributing factor. What about volcanoes? How does pressure affect them?
Well, one really cool example is Stromboli volcano in Italy. It's famous for its regular explosive bursts. They're caused by gas bubbles rising in the magma. And researchers noticed that these bursts happen more often when the atmospheric pressure drops.
Wait, so lower air pressure makes the volcano more active?
That seems to be the case. The theory is that when the air pressure is lower, it's like taking the lid off a pot. The gas bubbles in the magma can expand and escape more easily, leading to those more frequent eruptions.
Wow. So the volcano is basically breathing more freely when the air pressure is lower.
That's a great analogy. It's a reminder of how connected everything is, the atmosphere and the Earth itself.
You know, I need a moment to process all of this. We've gone from weather to health to airplanes to earthquakes and volcanoes. My head is spinning.
It's a lot to take in.
But it's so fascinating, and we've only just scratched the surface. We'll pick up this conversation next time with even more insights into the world of barometric pressure. Until then, keep an eye on that barometer.
Welcome back to our deep dive into barometric pressure.
You know, thinking about earthquakes and volcanoes, it just hit me how barometric pressure is all around us constantly, but we hardly ever think about it.
It's true. It's this invisible force shaping our world,
Mm.
but we take it for granted.
And we're using it more than ever these days, without even knowing it. Like, didn't you say our smartphones have built-in barometers now? I've always wondered what those are for.
That's a great point. Barometers have gotten so small and cheap, they're in everything now.
Yeah.
Your smartphone uses it to track altitude, which helps with GPS accuracy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they can even contribute to weather predictions.
So my phone is collecting data on barometric pressure all the time. What happens to all that information?
It's a goldmine for scientists and engineers. Like, meteorologists are using those readings from millions of smartphones to create really localized weather forecasts.
Whoa, that's cool. So instead of just using weather stations that could be miles away, they can get real-time data from our phones.
Exactly. It's like having a network of mini weather stations everywhere. This kind of crowdsourced data could revolutionize forecasting, and it could even help us respond better to severe weather.
That's amazing. It's like technology is letting us see these unseen forces in a whole new way.
It is. And it's not just about collecting data. Engineers are using barometric pressure in some really creative ways.
We've already talked about airplanes and buildings, but what else? Are there other examples?
Oh, definitely. Think about any industrial process that needs really precise pressure control. Manufacturing semiconductors, for instance. The purity and performance of those tiny chips in all our electronics, that depends a lot on maintaining specific pressure conditions.
Wait, those chips that are in everything these days, from our phones to our computers to our cars, they're all made using barometric pressure.
Pretty much. And here's something more every day. Have you ever had freeze-dried astronaut ice cream?
Of course, who hasn't?
Well, the secret is lowering the pressure.
Really? I thought it was all about temperature.
Temperature is part of it, but lowering the pressure allows the ice in the food to sublimate, which means it goes straight from a solid to a gas without melting. It's like a high-tech way to remove moisture.
So even our space-age snacks rely on barometric pressure. That's wild. There must be tons of other examples we don't even realize.
Absolutely. Car engines use barometric pressure sensors to adjust the fuel-air mixture at different altitudes.
Oh, right. Because the higher you go, the thinner the air gets. Makes sense.
Exactly. So we're surrounded by all these hidden applications of barometric pressure.
It's woven into our lives in so many ways. But what about the big picture? Are there still things about barometric pressure that scientists are trying to figure out?
Oh, tons. Even after studying it for centuries, there are still so many mysteries. One area that's really fascinating is the connection between pressure changes and human health.
We talked about migraines and joint pain, but what else are they looking at?
Well, we still don't completely understand why some people are so sensitive to pressure changes while others hardly notice them. It's probably a combination of genetics, physiology, and the environment.
Right. It's like everyone has their own internal barometer and they're all calibrated a bit differently. Is there a way to figure out how sensitive someone is?
Great question. And that's something scientists are actually working on. There's a lot of potential for studies that combine weather data with health monitoring, using things like wearable devices.
Yeah, like tracking someone's blood pressure and heart rate as the barometric pressure changes.
Exactly. It would be fascinating to see how our bodies react in real time. And if we understood those connections better, we might be able to develop new treatments.
I'd sign up for that study. And beyond health, there's still so much to learn about how barometric pressure affects the whole planet.
Absolutely. We talked about earthquakes and volcanoes, but there's also research on groundwater levels, ocean currents, even animal behavior.
It's like everything's connected, and barometric pressure is this ripple effect through the whole system.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
And as we get more data from all these different areas, we're starting to see the bigger picture. Barometric pressure is more than just a number on a weather report.
It's a fundamental force that affects everything. I've got to admit, this deep dive has really opened my eyes.
It's a common reaction. Once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere.
So after all this amazing information about barometric pressure, where do we go from here?
I think it's time to step back and think about what we've learned.
Yeah, what does it all mean? How does understanding barometric pressure change our view of the world? Let's talk about that. After all that, I'm starting to think of barometric pressure as this hidden language the planet is speaking, and we're just starting to understand a few words here and there.
I love that analogy. It is humbling, isn't it? This invisible force shaping everything around us, and we're mostly oblivious to it.
It's like we've been living in this world of pressure, and we're just now realizing it's even there.
Exactly. And the more we learn, the more we see how profoundly it connects everything. The atmosphere, the oceans, the land, even the Earth's interior.
It's true. I never thought about it that way before, but it's all linked, isn't it? Weather patterns, earthquakes, even our own health and barometric pressure is right there in the middle of it all.
Right. And it makes you wonder about the bigger picture, right?
Mhm.
Like we're talking about climate change possibly making storms more intense, creating even bigger pressure differences. What's that going to mean for, well, everything?
Mhm.
Our infrastructure, our health, the balance of ecosystems.
It is a little bit unsettling to think about, to be honest. Those are some huge questions, and we don't have all the answers yet.
We don't, but that's part of what makes it so fascinating to study. The more we understand, the better we can adapt, right?
Knowledge is power, as they say. But it's not all doom and gloom, is it? Are there some potential benefits to understanding barometric pressure better?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about avoiding the bad stuff. It's about opening up new possibilities. Like, imagine harnessing the power of barometric pressure for things like clean energy or new medical treatments, maybe even predicting natural disasters more accurately.
Now you're talking. It sounds like there's so much potential out there.
There is. And it's not just for scientists and engineers. Everyone can benefit from understanding a bit more about this force that shapes our world.
So if our listeners could take away one thing from all of this, what would it be? What's the most important message about barometric pressure?
I'd say the key takeaway is this. Barometric pressure is more than just a number on a weather report. It's this dynamic force that's constantly at work, influencing our weather, our health, the whole planet.
That's a great way to put it. And for me, the big takeaway is just a sense of awe, like how complex and interconnected our world is, and how something as simple as air pressure can play such a huge role.
It's been great exploring this with you.
Likewise. And thank you to all of you for listening to our deep dive into the world of barometric pressure. Hopefully you learned something new and maybe even gained a new appreciation for the air around you.
And one last thought. Now that you've heard all this, will you start noticing barometric pressure changes in your own life? We'd love to hear about it.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep diving deep.